Many states with republican forms of government became dictatorships between the First and Second World Wars, and Italy was one of those countries. Benito Mussolini was named prime minister in 1922 and ruled the country as a dictator until 1943. Mussolini's Fascist Party and its program called for glory, war, and empire. By the mid-1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, it made an effort to achieve these goals. Fascism was the ruling philosophy of nationalism, which supported industrialists and supposedly workers. They also emphasized order and obedience to the state and enforced a single-party government. Mussolini came to embody this philosophy during his rule of Italy. Although Italy had been one of the victors of the First World War, it was still weak, having struggled during the war. This was evident when Italy was not granted territories it had been promised in the Treaty of London in 1915, which brought Italy into the war against the Central Powers. France and Britain simply disregarded early promises, expecting Italy to comply. Italy was already severely divided internally as a result of regional, economic, and political issues before its entry into the First World War. Participation in the war meant even greater financial and social strain. Promises made to its 2 million soldiers, such as granting them farmland ownership, were not fulfilled, and the government owed huge amounts to banks and industrialists that had been borrowed for the war effort. Events such as riots, strikes, violence, a dysfunctional parliament, religious interference by the Catholic Church, the spread of communist ideology, and more led to several turbulent years. Mussolini formed a gang that was financed by industrialists and bankers, as well as other conservatives. In time, this gang, called the Black Shirts, grew enormously in number and power. By 1922, Mussolini had admirers such as the king, industrial leaders, and the middle economic classes. He threatened to march on Rome and seize the government. The king responded by naming him prime minister that year, a position he held until 1943. Soon, Mussolini was simply called El Duce, or the leader. Mussolini's political party, the National Fascist Party, was soon the only political party allowed. Internal dissent was suppressed by banning publications that opposed fascist views, outlawing labor unions and replacing them with government-managed organizations, resolving various long-term disputes with the Catholic Church, the creation of youth groups to teach the young about fascist ideology, and violence against opponents. Efforts were made to depict Mussolini's rule as a revival of the ancient Roman Empire. These efforts relied heavily on imagery and ancient symbolism, including the fasces, the use of the Roman letters, new versions of Roman-inspired architecture, public sculpture, and more. In terms of foreign policy, fascism advocated war and imperialism. Essentially, fascism held that the country should be prepared for war so that it could expand. Only through warfare could it become the great nation for which it was destined. While women were supposed to stay at home and produce strong, healthy children for Italy's future armies, men should be warriors for the state. Women were encouraged to have children. Those with the most children received awards. Various youth groups were founded by the Fascist Party to learn about fascism and to learn to march and shoot. This is an excerpt from a speech by Mussolini in which he said, "War is to man what maternity, or giving birth, is to a woman. From a philosophical and doctrinal viewpoint, I do not believe in perpetual peace. In terms of foreign policy, Italy was economically weak and therefore militarily weak. Italy's economy was dependent on Great Britain, France, and the US in the 1920s. While fascism advocated war and empire, there were clearly limits on what could be achieved without putting the country at financial risk. An embargo on fuel by the USA or Britain, for example, would severely restrict the economy. Reduction in food imports from France would cause food shortages in Italy and massive price increases. An unemployed, hungry population would possibly demand a change in government and remove Mussolini from power. Foreign policy had to be cautious. Italy's foreign policy in the 1920s was primarily opportunist, taking advantage of small incidences to gain politically. In the 1920s, Italy responded to the assassination of military officers who were ostensibly mapping Albania's borders by shelling Greece's island of Corfu. Greece, far weaker than Italy, was coerced into offering an indemnity in which Italy accepted. Yugoslavia, involved in its dispute with Italy over the city of Fiume, today's Rijeka, was also weak and simply handed the city over to Italy before it could be attacked. These foreign policy successes required little on the part of Italy. This is an excerpt from a book by Philip Morgan, published in 1995, called Italian Fascism. But Mussolini's predilection was to make trouble wherever he could and disparage the forms of conventional diplomacy, using methods of internal political subversion as covert, undeclared warfare on countries he regarded as Italy's enemies. The point is not that Mussolini could be credited with a decade of good behavior in foreign policy, but rather that the damage he could do in the 1920s was limited because of Italy's intrinsic economic and military weakness and the lack of counterbalance to affect the Anglo-French dominance in Europe, which Italy could exploit. Mussolini desired areas of southeastern France and the island of Corsica for Italy, since their population spoke dialects of Italian or were closely related languages and not French. Since France was a far greater power than Italy, these desires were simply tabled for the future. France, working to isolate Germany, included Italy in its diplomatic efforts and was not concerned with Italy's weak military. While Italy needed France economically, there was little friction between the two states. The creation of an Italian empire was not Mussolini's idea. It had been Italian policy for decades. Before the First World War, Italy managed to gain control of today's Libya from the Ottoman Empire. This territory had few people and few resources, and oil had yet to be discovered. This empire was more of a burden than an asset. Soon, Italy added Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, part of today's Somalia. Again, these were poor territories that did not add to the glory or economy of Italy. The Great Depression severely affected Italy's economy. It had to export its manufactured goods to pay for food imports, fuel, and raw materials for its industries. Britain, France, and the US, its main trade partners, erected trade barriers to protect their industries. So, to survive, Italy turned away from Western markets and traded more extensively with Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. These countries mainly exported raw materials and food, allowing Italy to export manufactured goods to them in return. This meant, in terms of foreign policy, that Italy had less fear of economic retaliation in response to its policies than it had before. So, in effect, the Great Depression gave Italy more freedom to operate its foreign policy than previously, and more in line with its fascist governing philosophies. Italy's government took greater control of its industries during the Great Depression. In what was termed the corporate state, the government attempted with limited success to have industries cooperate more closely with it. Industrial boards were established where government and industrial representatives, including people to represent the government-sponsored workers' organizations, could coordinate policy. This eliminated competition in industries such as steel, so that all producers set a single price for products and then divided the market between them. This meant that all major industries survived the Great Depression, and they did so by cooperating with the government. Mussolini's government also turned to deficit spending. Borrowing large sums of money, the government made large orders with cooperating industries. These included military equipment such as trucks, tanks, ships, and aircraft, as well as rifles, tires, shells, and engines. Workers in these industries would naturally spend their pay on food and consumer goods accordingly, causing other factories and industries to employ others. These newly employed people would also spend their money in markets and shops, keeping the economy healthy. The Army and Navy were both massively expanding, providing jobs for up to 1 million men by late 1935. This is an excerpt from Philip Morgan's Italian Fascism again, page 141. The worst of the Depression was 1932, when planning for the invasion of Abyssinia started. But the economy was beginning to recover during 1934. That recovery was certainly aided by the government's war-related commissions and contracts, which began to flow in late 1934 and early 1935, coinciding with and consequent on Mussolini's decision to invade. Preparation for war undoubtedly had an impact on employment, which by spring 1935 was down 250,000 from 1934. Some sectors benefited hugely from mobilization. The war itself and colonial administration, obviously enough of those supplying arms, clothing, equipment, transportation, and other logical services for the war effort and the running of the empire also benefited. Mussolini's Italy was better prepared for a more aggressive foreign policy as a result of the Great Depression. Not only was the country now less reliant on Western Europe and the United States economically, the government now had better control of industry and was in the midst of producing large amounts of military equipment. This meant that Mussolini's fascist goal for Italy could be realized in terms of foreign policy. As a result of this new reality, Mussolini reorganized his government in 1933, granting himself the positions of Ministry of War, Air and Navy, while also serving as Minister of the Interior and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and finally, Prime Minister. This is an excerpt from What is Fascism by Mussolini, originally published in 1932. He said this: "For fascism, the growth of empire, that is to say, the expansion of the nation, is an essential manifestation of vitality, and its opposite a sign of decadence. Peoples which are rising, or rising again after a period of decadence, are always imperialists, and renunciation is a sign of decay and of death. Fascism is the doctrine best adapted to represent these tendencies in the aspirations of people like the people of Italy, who are rising again after many centuries of abasement and foreign servitude. But empire demands discipline, the coordination of all forces, and a deeply felt sense of duty and sacrifice. This fact explains many aspects of the practical working of the regime, the character of many forces in the state, and the necessarily severe measures which must be taken against those who would oppose this spontaneous and inevitable movement of Italy in the 20th century, and would oppose it by recalling the outworn ideology of the 19th century, repudiated wheresoever there has been the courage to undertake great experiments of social and political transformation. For never before has the nation stood more in need of authority, of direction, and order. Germany offered the only European challenge to Italy's growing strength. After 1933, Germany was under the control of the Nazi Party. Italy had worked with France and Britain to isolate Germany after the First World War, and Austria was a buffer state between the two countries. Italy wanted to prevent any expansion of Germany into Austria or anywhere else for fear that it would replace Italy's interests in Central and Southeastern Europe, which had increased as a result of the Great Depression. Italy wanted Austria to remain in its sphere of influence and to limit German influence in the entire region as much as possible. In 1934, members of the Austrian version of the Nazi Party assassinated Austria's dictator Dollfuss. The plan was to overthrow the state and merge Austria and Germany. Mussolini immediately announced that Italian troops were heading to Italy's border with Austria. This was a clear threat to Germany that Italy would not allow Germany to absorb Austria and that Mussolini wanted it to remain independent. Germany had had an extremely weak army, and Hitler did not fully control his military at this point of his dictatorship. A military challenge by Italy might cause Germany's military to oppose Hitler, something Hitler was not prepared for. Hitler's government did not intervene, and the assassins and their co-conspirators were captured. Mussolini had demonstrated to his people and other states that Italy was now a significant military power. In April 1935, the heads of the government of Britain, France, and Italy met in Stressa, Italy, to form a common diplomatic front against Germany. This was partly in response to Germany's earlier move to annex Austria and a result of Germany's announcement that it would begin rearmament. All three countries condemned Germany's plan to rebuild its military, and all agreed to work together. Almost immediately, Britain and Germany signed a naval treaty without consulting either Italy or France, demonstrating that the Stressa front countries were not as united as their public statements indicated. Italy and France felt betrayed by Britain and spoke about the possibility of mutual military cooperation in case of war. These talks went absolutely nowhere as a result of the Abyssinian crisis. In conclusion, Mussolini's fascism promoted war. Italy was weak economically in the 1920s and early 1930s, so they were unable to do more than take advantage of minor opportunities like getting an indemnity from Greece and taking the city of Fiume from Yugoslavia. The Great Depression hits Italy in about 1929, and they become less reliant economically on Great Britain, France, and the United States. Then also there becomes more government control of industry and employment created partly by the massive increase of military spending. So as a result of the Great Depression, Italy became more independent and had a more aggressive foreign policy.